My husband looked at my 16-year-old daughter and said, "You need to find somewhere else to live because this is my house now." I married my husband 2 years ago after dating him for 3 years. He knew from the beginning that I had a daughter from my first marriage. Her name is Lily, and she was 13 when we started dating and 14 when he proposed. He always said he loved her like his own. He said he couldn't wait to be a real family. He said all the right things, and I believed every word because I wanted to believe them. My first husband left when Lily was 4 years old, and I'd been raising her alone ever since. The idea of having a partner who wanted to be part of our little family felt like a dream come true. We got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard, and Lily was my maid of honor. She gave a toast about how happy she was that her mom finally found someone who made her smile again. My husband cried during her speech. I thought those tears were real. After the wedding, my husband moved into the house I'd owned for 12 years. It was the house where I'd raised Lily, and the house my grandmother had left me when she passed away. My husband didn't contribute to the mortgage because there was no mortgage. He didn't pay property taxes because I handled those. He paid for groceries sometimes and covered the cable bill and acted like that made us equal partners in the household. I didn't mind because I loved him and I thought we were building a life together. The problem started small. He'd complain that Lily was too loud when she had friends over. He'd say she took too long in the bathroom in the mornings. He'd mention that teenagers ate too much food and that the grocery bill had gone up since he moved in. I reminded him that Lily had lived here her whole life and that she wasn't going anywhere. He'd nod and say he understood, and then bring it up again a week later. When Lily turned 15, he started pushing harder. He said she was old enough to get a job and pay for her own things. I said she was a sophomore in high school and her job was to focus on her grades. He said I was coddling her and that she needed to learn responsibility. I said she was responsible and that he needed to back off. He didn't back off. He started making comments directly to Lily. He'd ask her when she was planning to move out. He'd tell her that most kids her age were already thinking about their futures. He'd mention that his parents kicked him out at 17, and it was the best thing that ever happened to him. Lily started spending more time in her room. She stopped coming downstairs for family dinners. She stopped talking to me about her day because she didn't want to run into him in the kitchen. I watched my bright, happy daughter turn quiet and anxious, and I blamed myself for not seeing it sooner. Last month, everything came to a breaking point. Lily was in the living room doing homework when my husband came home from work. He walked in and saw her sitting on the couch, and something in his face changed. He told her to go to her room because he wanted to watch TV. Lily said she was almost done with her assignment and asked for 10 more minutes. He said this was his house and he didn't need to negotiate with a child. Lily looked at me standing in the doorway. I told my husband that Lily could finish her homework and that he could watch TV in the bedroom. He turned to me and said he was tired of tiptoeing around a kid who wasn't even his. He said he'd been patient for 2 years, and he was done pretending. He looked at Lily and told her she needed to find somewhere else to live, because this was his house now. Lily's face crumpled. She grabbed her books and ran upstairs, and I heard her door slam. I stood there looking at the man I'd married and realized I didn't recognize him anymore. I asked him what made him think this was his house. He said we were married, so everything that was mine was his too. I asked him if he'd read the prenup he signed before our wedding. His face changed. I reminded him that my grandmother's house was protected as separate property, and that he had no legal claim to it whatsoever. He said prenups could be challenged. I said he was welcome to try, but that he should probably talk to a lawyer first because he might be surprised by what he'd agreed to. I told him he had 30 days to find somewhere else to live. He laughed and said I couldn't kick him out of his own home. I told him again that it wasn't his home and that it never had been. He said I was bluffing and that I'd never choose a teenager over my husband. I told him that teenager was my daughter, and that I would choose her over anyone in the world, including him. He didn't believe me. He thought I'd calm down and change my mind. He thought I'd realize I needed him. He went to bed that night like nothing had happened. I slept in Lily's room on an air mattress because I wanted her to know I was on her side. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed while my husband was at work. The locksmith finished at 2 in the afternoon and handed me 3 new keys. I paid him in cash and watched him drive away. My phone started ringing before I even got back inside. My husband's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I declined it. He called a third time and I turned the sound off completely. By 4 o'clock, he'd called me 37 times. I knew because I checked the call log while sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open. Each voicemail was longer and angrier than the last one. The first few were confused, asking why the key wasn't working and telling me to call him back. Then they shifted to demanding I stop playing games and let him into his house. By message 20, he was yelling that I couldn't lock him out of his own home and he'd call the police if I didn't open the door immediately. I saved every single message. I opened a new folder on my computer and labeled it Documentation. I backed up the voicemails to 3 different locations. Then I texted him one sentence telling him he could collect his work clothes from the porch, but he wasn't coming inside. He called again. I didn't answer. Lily came downstairs around 5 and asked if everything was okay. I told her the locks were changed and her stepfather knew it. She nodded slowly and went back upstairs without saying anything else. At 7, I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Heavy footsteps crossed the porch. Then the pounding started. My husband's fist hit the door so hard the frame shook. He was yelling my name and demanding I let him in. He said I was being crazy and unreasonable and he just wanted to talk. The pounding got louder. He kicked the door twice. I heard him swearing and then his voice got closer to the door like he was pressing his face against it. He said I couldn't do this to him and he lived here and I was going to regret making him look like a fool. Lily appeared in my bedroom doorway. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking. I pulled her inside and closed the door. We sat on my bed listening to him rage on the front porch. He pounded and yelled for 20 minutes straight. Then everything went quiet. I heard his car start and the sound of gravel crunching as he backed out of the driveway too fast. Lily stayed frozen on the edge of my bed for a long time after the sound of his car faded. Then she looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked if I really meant what I said about choosing her over anyone. Her voice cracked on the last word. I pulled her into a hug and felt her whole body shaking against mine. I told her she'd been my priority since the day she was born, and I was sorry it took me this long to prove it. She started crying then, not the quiet tears she'd been holding back for months, but real sobbing that shook her shoulders. I held her and let her cry and told her I should have seen it sooner. She cried for what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red, but she looked lighter somehow. We stayed up until past midnight talking. She told me about all the small things I hadn't noticed. How he'd sigh dramatically whenever she spoke at dinner. How he'd forget to save her leftovers when I worked late, even though he always saved some for himself. How he'd turn the TV volume up when she was trying to study in the living room. How he'd make comments about her eating too much or taking too long in the bathroom or leaving her stuff around his house. Every story she shared made my chest hurt worse. I kept apologizing and she kept saying it wasn't my fault, but we both knew I should have protected her better. Over the next 3 days, my husband switched tactics completely. The angry calls stopped and the texts started. Long paragraphs about how he'd overreacted and he loved our family, and he was willing to go to counseling. He said Lily had misunderstood his intentions, and he was just trying to teach her responsibility like any good parent would. He said he'd been stressed at work and took it out on us, but he was going to do better. He said we could work through this if I'd just give him a chance. Each message was carefully worded and reasonable sounding. I read them and recognized the pattern I'd been missing for 2 years. The way he was rewriting what happened. Making himself the victim of misunderstanding instead of the person who told a 16-year-old girl to leave her own home. Making his cruelty sound like tough love. Making my protection of my daughter sound like an overreaction. I responded once. I told him the 30-day notice stood and all further communication needed to be in writing through lawyers. He called immediately. I didn't answer. He sent 5 more texts that got progressively less reasonable. I saved all of them in my documentation folder. My friend Rachel had recommended a family law attorney named Victoria Morgan. I called her office on Monday morning and explained my situation to the receptionist. She squeezed me in for Thursday afternoon. Victoria's office was in a converted house downtown with hardwood floors and bookshelves covering every wall. She was maybe 50 with gray hair pulled back in a bun and sharp eyes that didn't miss anything. I sat across from her desk and handed her a copy of my prenup. She read through it carefully while I tried not to fidget. After 10 minutes, she looked up and told me my house was completely protected as separate property and my husband had no legal claim to it whatsoever. The relief that washed through me made my hands shake. She explained the separation and divorce process step by step. She warned me that my husband would likely escalate when he realized I was serious about ending the marriage. She asked if he'd ever been violent, and I said no, but he'd been emotionally abusive to my daughter. She helped me start documenting everything for a potential restraining order. When I walked out of her office an hour later, I felt scared, but also clear-headed for the first time since I'd said I do 2 years ago. My husband refused to look for a new place or pack any of his belongings. He acted like the 30-day notice was just me being dramatic, and I'd change my mind any day now. He was staying at his friend John's house, but he kept showing up at random times trying to talk sense into me. On day 12, I was making lunch when I heard a key in the lock. My blood went cold before I remembered I'd changed them. The door handle rattled. Then my husband's face appeared in the kitchen window. Lily was sitting at the table doing homework. She froze when she saw him. He tapped on the glass and gestured for me to let him in. I shook my head. He started talking through the window about how teenagers need tough love and structure, and I was doing Lily a disservice by coddling her. His voice was muffled, but I could hear every word. I walked over and physically positioned myself between the window and Lily. I told him to leave immediately. Something in my voice must have gotten through because he actually stopped talking. He stared at me for a long moment, and then walked back to his car without another word. My mother called me that evening. She said my husband had contacted her claiming I'd had some kind of breakdown and kicked him out for no reason. She suggested marriage counseling. She reminded me how hard it was to be a single parent, and how lonely I'd been before I met him. I felt the old guilt rising up in my chest, the fear that maybe I was overreacting, the worry that I was making a terrible mistake. Then I remembered Lily's crumpled face when he told her to leave. I told my mother she didn't have all the information, and I needed her to trust my judgment on this. She went quiet. Then she said she hoped I knew what I was doing and hung up. The conversation left me feeling shaky and uncertain. I called Rachel and told her what happened. She reminded me that my mother hadn't seen what I'd seen, and she didn't know how Lily had been suffering. That helped more than I expected. Victoria had assigned a paralegal named Liam to help with my case. He called me the following week and asked if I wanted to understand my husband's financial situation better. He said it might help explain why he was fighting so hard to stay in my house. I met Liam at a coffee shop near the courthouse. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with glasses and a laptop covered in legal aid stickers. He pulled up credit reports and bank statements he'd obtained through discovery requests. What he showed me made everything click into place. My husband had been living beyond his means for years. Credit card debt over $40,000. Car payments on a truck he couldn't afford. Personal loans he'd taken out to cover other loans. His salary was decent, but not enough to support his lifestyle and pay rent anywhere. My house had been subsidizing everything. I'd been providing free housing while he spent his entire paycheck on himself. The discovery made me feel vindicated, but also used. I realized he might have proposed partly because marrying me solved his money problems. Liam printed everything out for my records. I added it all to my documentation folder. 2 days later, I got a call from Lily's school. The counselor's name was Alina Hunt, and her voice was gentle but concerned. She told me that Lily had broken down crying during a college planning session when asked about her home life. Alina said she wished someone had reached out sooner because Lily had been showing signs of anxiety and depression all semester. My guilt crashed over me so hard I had to sit down. I'd been so focused on making my marriage work that I'd missed my own daughter falling apart right in front of me. Alina reassured me that recognizing the problem and taking action was what mattered now. She said Lily had mentioned that things were better at home recently, and she seemed relieved. That helped a little, but I still felt like I'd failed the one person who'd always depended on me. On day 31, I came home from work at 5:30. Lily had volleyball practice until 6, so the house should have been empty. But when I opened the door, I heard the TV on in the living room. My husband was sitting on the couch with his feet on my coffee table like he owned the place. My heart started racing. He looked up at me and said he still had a key, so technically he wasn't trespassing. I realized he must have made a copy before I changed the locks. He said I'd had my tantrum and now we needed to talk like adults about our marriage. His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and walked back out to my car. I called Lily and told her to go to Rachel's house after practice. Then I called the police from my car and reported that my separated husband had broken into my home. 2 officers showed up within 20 minutes. I waited in my car until they arrived. They went inside and I heard raised voices. My husband came out 10 minutes later with the officers behind him. He glared at me as he walked past my car. One of the officers came over and took my statement. She asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes. She gave me a case number and told me to contact a lawyer about a restraining order. After they left, I sat in my driveway for another hour before I felt steady enough to go inside. The next morning, I called Victoria. She said she'd been expecting this. We filed for a restraining order that afternoon. The court hearing was scheduled for 5 days later. Victoria spent 3 hours preparing me for what to expect. I had to write down every threatening message, every boundary violation, every time Lily had felt unsafe in her own home. Putting it all in writing made the pattern impossible to deny. But I was scared the judge wouldn't take it seriously enough because my husband had never actually hit anyone. Victoria said emotional abuse and harassment were valid grounds for protection orders. She said judges were getting better at recognizing patterns of control and intimidation. I wanted to believe her, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking as I signed all the paperwork. The restraining order paperwork sat in my email inbox for 2 days before my husband found out about it. I don't know how he got the information so fast, but he must have been checking court records or maybe his lawyer told him. Within hours of the filing becoming public, my phone started buzzing with messages from people I hadn't talked to in months. The first one came from Sarah, a friend from my book club who I'd gotten close to during the early days of my marriage. She sent a long text about how shocked she was to hear what was happening, and how she always thought we were such a happy couple. She asked if we could talk because she wanted to understand my side of things. I called her that evening and tried to explain the situation without going into too much detail about Lily's experiences. Sarah kept interrupting to say that marriage was hard and that everyone went through rough patches. She said her own husband had said some harsh things over the years, but they worked through it. I realized she wasn't actually listening to what I was telling her. She'd already decided I was overreacting before she even picked up the phone. 2 more friends reached out over the next week with similar messages. They'd talked to my husband, or heard his version from someone else, and they wanted to know why I was being so extreme. One of them actually used the word vindictive when she asked why I was trying to keep him away from his stepdaughter. I stopped responding after that because I knew anything I said would get twisted and shared with people who'd already made up their minds. My brother Jacob called on a Thursday night after he heard about the restraining order through our mother. He didn't ask for my side of the story or question my decisions. He just said he was proud of me for protecting Lily, and that he'd been worried about my husband for a while. I asked him what he meant, and he said there were little things he'd noticed at family gatherings. The way my husband would make comments about Lily's appearance or her friends or her grades. Jacob said he'd almost said something a few times but didn't want to overstep. I told him I wished he had. He reminded me that I probably wouldn't have listened back then because I was still trying to make the marriage work. He was right about that. Jacob told me that anyone who sided with my husband without asking questions wasn't really my friend anyway. He said real friends trusted your judgment and supported your choices even when they didn't understand all the details. That conversation helped more than he probably knew because I was starting to feel like maybe I was the problem. Losing those friendships hurt in a way I didn't expect. These were people I'd shared meals with and confided in and celebrated holidays alongside. Now they were treating me like I'd done something wrong by protecting my daughter. I kept thinking about all the times I'd supported them through their own problems without questioning their decisions. The double standard made me angry, but it also made me sad because it showed me how little they actually knew me. Lily came into my room one night about a week after the restraining order was filed. It was late, almost 11, and I was lying in bed staring at my phone trying to decide whether to respond to another concerned message from someone who clearly thought I was making a mistake. She knocked softly and asked if she could come in. I put the phone down and told her of course. She sat on the edge of my bed and picked at the comforter for a minute without saying anything. Then she looked at me and said she needed to tell me something she'd never told anyone before. My stomach dropped because I knew whatever came next was going to be bad. She started talking about the last 2 years and all the things my husband had done when I wasn't around. He told her she was the reason we couldn't take vacations because she cost too much money. He said it multiple times, always when I was at work or out running errands. He'd bring up how much cheaper life would be without a teenager in the house. Lily said she started feeling guilty every time I bought her new clothes or school supplies because she knew he was keeping track of every dollar spent on her. She told me about the nights when I worked late and my husband would make dinner for himself but forget to save her any. She'd come downstairs hungry and find him eating on the couch, and when she asked if there were leftovers, he'd act surprised and say he thought she'd already eaten. It happened enough times that she started keeping granola bars in her room so she wouldn't have to ask him for food. She described the way he'd sigh whenever she spoke at the dinner table. This long, dramatic exhale like listening to her was physically painful. He did it so consistently that she stopped talking during meals unless I asked her a direct question. She thought maybe she was being too sensitive until she noticed he never sighed when I was talking, only when she was. The full picture of his calculated campaign to make her feel unwelcome in her own home broke something in me. These weren't just moments of frustration or adjustment struggles like I'd told myself. This was deliberate and sustained emotional cruelty designed to push a child out of her own house. I apologized to Lily for not seeing it sooner and for not protecting her the way I should have. She said it wasn't my fault because he was careful to only do these things when I wasn't watching. She said she didn't tell me because she was afraid I'd choose him over her. That admission hurt worse than anything else because it meant my daughter had been living with that fear for 2 years. I pulled her into a hug and promised her that I would always choose her, that there was no universe where I would pick anyone over my own child. We stayed up talking until almost 2 in the morning, and she told me more stories that made me want to go back in time and kick my husband out the day he first made her feel small. The restraining order hearing happened on a Tuesday morning at 9. Victoria met me outside the courthouse at 8:30 to go over everything one more time. She reminded me to stay calm and stick to the facts no matter what my husband said or how he tried to twist things. We walked through security and found seats in the hallway outside the courtroom. My husband showed up 15 minutes later wearing a suit I'd never seen before, probably borrowed or bought specifically for this. He looked reasonable and calm, like a concerned spouse who just wanted to work things out. His lawyer was with him, a woman in her 50s who kept glancing at me with this expression that seemed almost sympathetic. When they called our case, we all filed into the courtroom and took our seats. The judge was a man in his 60s with reading glasses that he kept pushing up his nose. He reviewed the paperwork for a few minutes while we sat in silence. Then he started asking my husband questions about the incident where he'd entered the house after being told to stay away. My husband's voice was steady and polite as he explained that he just wanted to talk to his wife like adults. He said he didn't realize using a key he'd had made months ago would be considered breaking in. The judge asked him about the 30-day notice to vacate and whether he understood that the house belonged to me as separate property. My husband's mask slipped a little bit. He referred to my house as our marital home and said that marriage meant sharing everything. Victoria had warned me this would happen, that his sense of entitlement would show through once he started talking. The judge asked him why he thought he had a right to enter a home he'd been explicitly told to leave. My husband said he was just trying to prepare his stepdaughter for the real world and that I was being overprotective. He called Lily difficult and disrespectful. He said she needed to learn that life had consequences and that I was doing her a disservice by coddling her. The judge's expression changed when my husband started talking about Lily. He asked my husband to clarify what he meant by preparing a 16-year-old for the real world by telling her to find somewhere else to live. My husband tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. His entitlement was right there in the open for everyone to see. The judge granted a 6-month restraining order and ordered my husband to stay away from both me and Lily. He said any violation would result in immediate arrest. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. Victoria squeezed my arm and said that went as well as we could have hoped. My husband and his lawyer left through a different exit. I didn't see him again that day. The next problem came when I tried to take my husband's name off the utility accounts. I'd assumed it would be simple since the accounts were originally in my name and the house was my property. But when I called the electric company, they told me they needed both signatures to remove an authorized user. I explained that we were separated and he'd been ordered to stay away from me. The customer service representative said she understood, but company policy required both signatures. I asked to speak to a supervisor. The supervisor repeated the same policy. I spent 3 hours on the phone that day getting nowhere. Liam helped me figure out a workaround. He drafted affidavits stating that I was the sole property owner and that my husband had added his name to the accounts without my permission. We attached copies of the deed, the prenup, and the restraining order. Then Liam called the utility companies himself and worked his way up the chain until he found someone willing to review the documentation. It took 3 weeks of frustrating phone calls and multiple rounds of paperwork. The electric company finally removed his name after 2 weeks. The water company took longer because they had different verification procedures. Every time I thought we'd cleared the last hurdle, another requirement would pop up. My husband refused to cooperate out of spite, ignoring calls from the utility companies and refusing to sign anything his lawyer sent over. He was leaving bills in limbo, hoping it would force me to contact him directly. Liam warned me not to take the bait. He said my husband was looking for any excuse to claim I'd violated the restraining order or to reestablish communication. Eventually, we got everything straightened out, but it took way more time and energy than it should have. I reclaimed full control of my household utilities and had all the account numbers changed, so my husband couldn't access any information about my usage or billing. 2 weeks after the restraining order hearing, Victoria called to tell me my husband's lawyer had sent over a letter. I asked if it was about the divorce, and she said not exactly. She read it to me over the phone. The letter proposed that we pause the divorce proceedings and try separation counseling instead. It was full of therapy language about communication breakdowns and blended family challenges. It talked about the importance of working through difficulties rather than giving up on a marriage. It suggested that with professional help, we could find better ways to address our different parenting styles. The letter completely ignored everything my husband had done to Lily. It reframed his emotional abuse as a parenting disagreement. It made the whole situation sound like a misunderstanding that could be fixed with better communication. Victoria said this was a common tactic to delay proceedings and maintain control. She'd seen it dozens of times in cases like mine. The goal was to make me feel guilty for not trying hard enough, and to buy my husband more time to figure out his next move. She asked if I wanted to consider the proposal. I told her absolutely not. I instructed her to proceed with the divorce filing immediately. She said she'd have the papers ready by the end of the week. True to her word, she served him the following week. I got a text from Victoria on a Wednesday afternoon saying the process server had delivered the papers to my husband at his work. I felt a strange mix of emotions when I read that message. Part of me was relieved that we were moving forward. Part of me was terrified of what came next. Filing for divorce made everything feel both real and final in a way that changing the locks and getting the restraining order hadn't. This was the official end of my marriage, documented in legal paperwork and court filings. My husband had 30 days to respond, and Victoria expected him to fight over property division, despite the prenup clearly protecting my assets. She said people like him didn't give up easily, even when they knew they had no legal ground to stand on. I spent that weekend going through wedding photos and cards. I'd stored them all in a box in my closet and hadn't looked at them since the first anniversary. I sat on my bedroom floor and went through each photo, each card, each memento, from a day that was supposed to be the start of our future together. In the wedding photos, my husband looked happy, and I looked hopeful. Lily looked beautiful in her maid of honor dress. We all looked like people who believed in the promises being made. I read through the cards from friends and family wishing us a lifetime of happiness. I found the toast Lily had written about how glad she was that her mom finally found someone who made her smile again. Looking at all of it with the knowledge I had now felt like watching a different person's life. The future I'd imagined when I said I do had never existed outside my own hopeful imagination. The man I'd married wasn't who I thought he was. Maybe he'd hidden his true nature during our dating years. Or maybe I'd been so desperate for partnership that I'd ignored the signs that were there all along. Either way, the marriage I was mourning wasn't real. It was a story I'd told myself about who we were and what we could be. The actual marriage, the one where my husband slowly pushed my daughter out of her own home while I made excuses for him, that marriage deserved to end. I put the photos and cards back in the box and stored it in the garage. Maybe someday I'd be able to look at them without feeling this particular brand of sadness. For now, I needed to focus on moving forward. Something shifted in Lily over the next few weeks. She started smiling again, these small moments of lightness that reminded me of who she'd been before my husband moved in. She brought friends home after school without asking permission first, just walked in with 2 girls from her volleyball team and headed straight to the kitchen for snacks. She played music in her room loud enough that I could hear it downstairs, some pop song with a beat that made her door rattle. She sprawled on the living room couch doing homework with her books spread across the cushions and her feet up on the armrest. Little by little, she was reclaiming her space and her confidence. I watched her laugh at something on her phone one afternoon and realized I hadn't heard her laugh like that in months. The sound made my chest feel tight in a good way. We still had hard days where she'd go quiet and withdrawn, where I could tell she was thinking about everything that happened. But the good days were starting to outnumber the bad ones. She talked more at dinner, telling me stories about her teachers and her friends without that underlying anxiety that someone was going to tell her to be quiet. She asked if she could redecorate her room, and we spent a Saturday at the home improvement store picking out new paint colors and bedding. She chose a light blue for the walls and white furniture to replace the dark wood set she'd had since middle school. We painted together over a long weekend, covering drop cloths and taping off trim, and getting more paint on ourselves than on the walls. Lily put on a playlist and we sang along badly while we worked. It felt like we were painting over more than just old wall color. We were covering up the last 2 years and starting fresh. Watching her reclaim her space and confidence made every difficult conversation and lost friendship worth it. We weren't all the way back to where we'd been before I met my husband, but we were heading in the right direction. The house felt lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted that I hadn't fully realized we were carrying. I started thinking about the early days of dating my husband, trying to pinpoint when I should have known better. The red flags had been there if I'd been willing to see them. Small comments about Lily that I'd dismissed as adjustment struggles. Jokes about teenagers being expensive that I'd laughed off because I thought he was just being funny. The way he'd suggest activities that were just the two of us, framing it as important couple time, but really excluding Lily from our plans. I'd been so grateful for adult companionship after years of single parenting that I'd minimized every concern. I'd made excuses for behavior that should have alarmed me. When he complained about Lily being too loud, I told myself he just needed time to adjust to living with a teenager. When he suggested she get a job at 15, I convinced myself he was trying to teach her responsibility. I'd reframed every red flag as a misunderstanding or a difference in parenting styles rather than seeing the pattern of someone who resented my daughter's existence. Part of me wanted to beat myself up for being so blind, but my therapist helped me understand that recognizing manipulation didn't mean I was stupid for falling for it. She said people like my husband were skilled at presenting themselves as exactly what you needed. They said the right things and showed you the version of themselves that you wanted to see. The fact that I'd eventually recognized the truth and taken action was what mattered. I was learning to forgive myself for the mistake while still acknowledging the harm it caused Lily. That balance was hard to find. Some days I felt okay about my choices, and other days I felt crushing guilt for not protecting her sooner. But I was working through it, trying to be gentler with myself while also holding space for the reality that my decisions had consequences. Understanding that I'd been manipulated didn't erase those consequences, but it helped me move forward without getting stuck in shame. 3 months after I changed the locks, Victoria called with unexpected news. My husband's lawyer had contacted her to say they were accepting the divorce terms without contest. He wasn't going to fight over property division or try to claim any part of the house or my other assets. He just wanted the process over as quickly as possible. Victoria said she was surprised because she'd expected him to drag things out for months. I asked what changed, and she said she didn't know for sure, but suspected he'd finally talked to a lawyer who explained exactly how ironclad the prenup was. Whatever the reason, he'd given up. The divorce would be finalized in 60 days, ending a 2-year marriage that never should have happened. I felt relief more than sadness when Victoria gave me the news. There was a small part of me that felt something like grief for the future I'd imagined, but mostly I just felt ready to move on, ready to close this chapter and focus on rebuilding the peaceful home Lily and I had before I'd complicated everything by getting married. Victoria said she'd send over the final paperwork for me to review and sign. After that, it was just a matter of waiting for the court to process everything and issue the final decree. She congratulated me on getting through one of the hardest things a person could go through. I thanked her for all her help and told her I couldn't have done it without her guidance. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a few minutes just breathing. It was almost over. Soon my husband would be officially out of our lives, and Lily and I could really start fresh. Lily and I developed new routines over those last 2 months of waiting for the divorce to finalize. Sunday mornings became pancake time, where she'd request different mix-ins and I'd try to accommodate whatever combination she came up with. We had chocolate chip and blueberry, and once she asked for peanut butter chips, which turned out better than expected. Friday nights were movie nights where she picked the film and I supplied the popcorn and candy. She chose everything from old comedies I'd never heard of to horror movies that made me cover my eyes. We talked more openly now about everything from the school drama to college plans to boys she thought were cute. She told me about her friends and their problems and asked for advice on things she never would have brought up when my husband lived here. Our relationship wasn't magically perfect, because we still had disagreements about curfew and homework and cleaning her room. But there was trust again in a way there hadn't been for 2 years. She knew I would always choose her over anyone else. She knew this was her home and nobody was going to push her out of it. We were learning to be a family of 2 again, and it felt right in a way that the family of 3 never had. The house was peaceful, Lily was happy, I was healing, we were going to be okay. The divorce finalized on a Tuesday morning in late January. Victoria called me at work to say the judge had signed the papers and it was officially done. No dramatic courtroom scene or last-minute arguments. Just signatures on legal documents that ended a 2-year marriage. I thanked her for everything she'd done to help me through the process. She said I'd done the hard part by standing up for myself and my daughter. After we hung up, I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen for a few minutes, processing the fact that I was no longer married. The relief I felt was bigger than any sadness. That night, I picked Lily up from the school and told her we were going out to celebrate. She asked what we were celebrating, and I said our fresh start. We went to her favorite Italian restaurant and ordered too much food and talked about redecorating the living room now that we could make it feel like ours again. Lily wanted to paint one wall a dark blue color and hang string lights across the ceiling. We talked about planning a summer trip together, maybe driving up the coast and staying in little beach towns. Just the 2 of us exploring and making new memories. Life wasn't perfect, and I was still stressed about money and dealing with some hurt from everything that happened. But my daughter was happy and safe in her own home. That was everything that mattered to me. We were moving forward together as a family of 2. For the first time in 2 years, our house felt peaceful again,